The year was 1944, and the world was engulfed in the chaos of World War II. The temperature on this particular day, June 6th, was a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a gentle mist clinging to the air like a damp shroud. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel wafted through the atmosphere, carried on the faint breeze that rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. In the distance, the sound of seagulls could be heard, their cries piercing the air as they soared overhead, oblivious to the impending battle that was about to unfold. On the horizon, a fleet of Allied ships, comprising of American, British, and Canadian vessels, stretched out as far as the eye could see. The ships, a mix of destroyers, cruisers, and landing craft, were arrayed in a complex pattern, their wakes cutting through the choppy waters of the English Channel like a series of arrows pointing towards the shore. The sun was slowly rising, casting a golden glow over the scene, illuminating the rows of ships and the tiny figures of soldiers and sailors scurrying about on deck. On board the USS CT-608, a landing craft tank, the crew was busily preparing for the impending invasion. The ship's ramp, adorned with the numeral 608 in bold, black letters, was slowly being lowered, revealing the dark, cavernous interior of the vessel. Inside, a platoon of American soldiers, clad in olive drab uniforms, and equipped with M1 Garand rifles, the iconic .306 caliber gun that was the mainstay of the American infantry. M1 carbines, the lighter, more compact alternative, were checking their gear and mentally preparing themselves for the battle ahead. The soldiers, members of the 1st Infantry Division, also known as the Big Red One, were a mix of seasoned veterans and green recruits, all united in their determination to take the fight to the enemy. They were equipped with a variety of gear, including the M1911 pistol, a trusted sidearm that had been a staple of American military issue since 1911, and the M3 fighting knife, a sturdy, reliable blade that was designed for close-quarters combat. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil, sweat, and the faint tang of fear as the soldiers steeled themselves for the unknown dangers that lay ahead. As the ramp continued to lower, the sounds of the ship's engines and the murmur of conversations among the crew and soldiers created a cacophony of noise that was both deafening and exhilarating. The soldiers, their faces set with determination, began to move towards the ramp, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the distant shore of Normandy beckoned like a siren's call. The M4 Sherman tanks, parked at the rear of the ship, their 75mm guns and .50 caliber machine guns at the ready, waited patiently for their turn to disembark, their crews busy checking the tracks, engines, and armament, making sure that everything was in working order. The tanks, with their distinctive sloping armor and rugged, dependable design, were the mainstay of the Allied armored forces, and would play a crucial role in the battle to come. The soldiers, as they moved towards the ramp, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale of the operation, the enormity of which was only beginning to sink in. The invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the largest amphibious assault in history, with over 156,000 troops set to land on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the French coast. As the ramp finally touched the water, a wave of anticipation swept through the soldiers, followed by a deep, collective breath as they steeled themselves for the plunge into the unknown. The first soldier, a young private from Iowa, clad in a waterproof jacket and carrying a backpack full of gear, hesitated for a moment at the top of the ramp, his eyes scanning the horizon, before taking a deep breath and stepping forward into the void. The sound of his boots splashing into the water was like a signal, and soon the other soldiers were following, their movements slow and deliberate, as they made their way down the ramp and into the churning sea. The water, icy cold and crystal clear, was a shock to the system, but the soldiers didn't have time to dwell on the discomfort, as they quickly formed up into their assigned units and began to move towards the shore. The tanks, now free to disembark, rumbled and lurched as they made their way down the ramp, their tracks splashing into the water, sending plumes of spray high into the air. The sound of their engines, a deep, throaty growl, was like music to the ears of the soldiers, who knew that the tanks would provide them with the firepower and protection they needed to take on the enemy. As the soldiers and tanks made their way towards the shore, the air was filled with the sound of artillery fire, the distant boom of naval guns, and the staccato rattle of machine guns, as the Allied forces began to soften up the German defenses. The smell of smoke and cordite hung in the air, mingling with the salt water and diesel fuel, creating a pungent, acrid aroma that was both familiar and terrifying. The soldiers, their senses on high alert, moved forward, their eyes scanning the horizon, their guns at the ready, as they prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the most pivotal battles in history. As the forces of the opposing armies clashed on the battlefield, the intricacies of their tactical maneuvers became increasingly evident. The left flank of the enemy's formation, comprised of heavily armored infantry, began to push forward in a slow and deliberate manner, their shields locked in a tight phalanx formation. This wall of steel and wood presented a formidable obstacle to the advancing troops, who were forced to navigate through a veritable maze of defensive obstacles, including trenches, abattis, and chevaux de frise. In response to this developing threat, the commander of the attacking force ordered his right flank to execute a subtle yet crucial maneuver, wheeling their line to the left in an attempt to outflank the enemy's formidable phalanx. This clever tactical adjustment allowed the attackers to bring their numeric superiority to bear, as a fresh wave of troops was funneled into the fray, attacking the exposed flank of the enemy's formation. The enemy, anticipating this very move, had secretly positioned a reserve force of lightly armored skirmishers, who now emerged from their concealed positions to harass and disrupt the attacking troops. As the skirmishers danced around the edges of the battlefield, firing their bows and javelins at the attacking troops, the main body of the enemy's formation continued its slow and deliberate advance. The enemy's center, comprised of heavily armored cavalry, now began to stir, their horses, hooves, thundering against the earth as they prepared to charge. The attacking troops, aware of the impending cavalry charge, rapidly reformed their lines, creating a dense and impenetrable barrier of pikes and shields. The cavalry, undaunted by this formidable obstacle, charged forward with reckless abandon, their lances shattering against the wall of steel as they attempted to break through the enemy's lines. Meanwhile, on the enemy's right flank, a bitter and intense struggle was unfolding, as the attacking troops attempted to outflank and encircle their opponents. The enemy's lines, though wavering, refused to break, and a desperate and brutal melee ensued, with soldiers on both sides engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The attackers, driven by their superior numbers and ferocity, slowly but inexorably began to gain the upper hand, pushing the enemy's lines back through a combination of brute force and clever tactical maneuvering. As the battle raged on, the enemy's commander, aware of the growing threat to his right flank, dispatched a trusted messenger to hasten the arrival of his reserve forces, which had been stationed at a safe distance from the battlefield. The messenger, navigating through the chaos and confusion of the fray, finally reached the reserve forces and conveyed the commander's urgent instructions, whereupon the reserve troops rapidly formed up and marched towards the battlefield, their arrival imminent and eagerly anticipated by the hard-pressed enemy troops. The attackers, meanwhile, continued to press their advantage, their lines surging forward in a relentless and merciless onslaught. The enemy's formations, though badly battered and bruised, still refused to yield, and a series of fierce and desperate counterattacks were launched in a last-ditch attempt to stem the tide of the battle. The attackers, however, remained resolute and unyielding, their superior numbers and tactical cohesion ultimately proving too great for the enemy to withstand. As the enemy's lines finally began to break and disintegrate, the attackers surged forward in a triumphant and jubilant cry, their victory all but assured. The victorious troops, their arms raised in triumph and exhaustion, now began the laborious and gruesome task of consolidating their gains, tending to their wounded, and dispatching their defeated foes. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of utter devastation, the once pristine landscape now scarred and disfigured by the ravages of war. The air was thick with the stench of death and destruction, and the cries of the wounded and the dying mingled with the triumphant shouts of the victors, creating a haunting and unforgettable tableau that would remain etched in the memories of all who had witnessed the carnage. In the midst of this chaotic and nightmarish scene, the commander of the victorious force, surveying the wreckage of the enemy's formations, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and satisfaction at the bravery and tenacity of his troops. The battle had been won, but at great cost, and the true extent of the carnage would only become apparent in the days and weeks that followed. For now, however, the victors could bask in the glory of their triumph, their names etched forever in the annals of history, as the heroes of a battle that would be remembered for generations to come. As the victorious troops began the slow and arduous process of regrouping and reorganizing, the enemy's defeated commander, surveying the wreckage of his shattered army, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret and despair. The battle had been lost. and with it the hopes and dreams of his people had been crushed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, and the defeated commander knew that he faced a daunting and uncertain future as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his defeat. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. The victorious troops, though jubilant and triumphant, knew that they faced many more challenges and battles in the days and weeks that lay ahead. The enemy, though defeated, would not go quietly into the night, and the victors could expect fierce and determined resistance as they pushed deeper into the heart of the enemy's territory. The true test of their mettle was only just beginning, and the victorious troops steeled themselves for the trials and tribulations that lay ahead, knowing that their bravery and resolve would be tested to the very limit. As the mechanized infantry battalion advanced through the densely forested terrain, the sounds of artillery fire and small arms grew louder, piercing the air with a cacophony of chaos. The M2 Bradley fighting vehicles, with their 25mm M242 Bushmaster chain guns, led the charge, spewing forth a hail of armor-piercing rounds that shredded the underbrush and sent splintered tree trunks crashing to the ground. The vehicles' tracks churned up the earth, sending geysers of mud and debris flying in all directions as they pushed forward, their crews scanning the surroundings for any sign of enemy activity. Behind the Bradleys, the M1 Abrams tanks rumbled forward, their 120mm smoothbore cannons at the ready, prepared to unleash a barrage of high-explosive rounds at a moment's notice. The tanks' advanced fire control systems, which utilized a combination of laser rangefinders, thermal imaging, and GPS, allowed them to engage targets with pinpoint accuracy, even in the most turbulent of environments. As they moved, the tanks' crews worked in tandem with the infantry, providing covering fire and suppressing enemy strongpoints to facilitate the advance. To the flanks, the dismounted infantry moved cautiously, their M4 carbines at the ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of enemy movement. The soldiers' advanced combat helmets, equipped with integrated communication systems and ballistic protection, allowed them to stay connected with their command structure while minimizing their exposure to harm. As they pushed forward, they encountered pockets of enemy resistance, which they quickly overcame using a combination of precision firepower and old-fashioned infantry know-how. The battle raged on, a maelstrom of noise and fury that seemed to engulf everything in its path. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, the earth shaking beneath the feet of the combatants as they clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire. In the midst of this chaos, the commanders worked tirelessly to coordinate their forces, directing artillery fire and close air support to break up enemy concentration and shatter their will to resist. As the fight intensified, the medical evacuation teams sprang into action, their UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters swooping in to extract the wounded and ferry them to safety. The medevac crews, trained to operate in the most hazardous of environments, worked with precision and speed, stabilizing the injured and preparing them for transport to rear-area medical facilities. Their efforts were a beacon of hope in the midst of the turmoil, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were still those who cared, who worked to preserve life and alleviate suffering. Meanwhile, the logistics teams toiled behind the scenes, working to keep the war machine supplied and functioning. They hauled ammunition and fuel to the front lines, their convoys threading their way through the crowded roads and dodging the wreckage of abandoned vehicles. The logisticians worked tirelessly, often under fire, to maintain the flow of critical supplies, ensuring that the combat troops had what they needed to keep fighting. Their efforts were the unsung heroes of the battle, the backbone that supported the combatants and allowed them to focus on their mission. As the day wore on, the battle showed no signs of abating. The two sides were evenly matched, each determined to emerge victorious. The fighting ebbed and flowed, with one side gaining the upper hand, only to be pushed back by a fierce counterattack. The commanders pored over their maps and intelligence report, thus searching for any weakness in the enemy's defenses that they could exploit. They directed their forces with precision, using every tool at their disposal to outmaneuver and outfight their opponents. In the midst of this cauldron of chaos, the individual soldiers fought on, driven by a mix of adrenaline, training, and sheer determination. They were the tip of the spear, the cutting edge of their nation's military power. As they clashed with the enemy, they drew on every ounce of skill and cunning they possessed, using their advanced training and equipment to outwit and overpower their foes. The battle was a test of endurance, a trial by fire that would push them to their limits and beyond. And yet, despite the fury of the combat, there were moments of clarity, of lucid understanding that cut through the confusion and chaos. A soldier would see a comrade fall, and in that instant, their world would narrow to a single focus: to protect their friend, to keep them safe. A commander would make a decision, one that would determine the course of the battle and the fate of their troops. These moments were the essence of war, the distillation of all the training and preparation into a single, shining instant of purpose and meaning. The battle raged on, a seemingly endless vortex of noise and destruction, but within its heart, there were moments of beauty, of courage and sacrifice that would be etched into the memories of those who fought. These moments would stay with them forever, a reminder of the bonds they forged in the fire of combat, and the unbreakable ties that united them as brothers and sisters in arms. As the fight continued, the soldiers pushed forward, driven by their training, their equipment, and their unwavering commitment to one another. They were a team, a cohesive unit, bound together by a shared sense of purpose, and they would stop at nothing to achieve their missions. As the battle raged on, the sounds of gunfire and screams filled the air, creating a cacophony of chaos that seemed to pierce through the very soul of every soldier on the battlefield. The earth trembled beneath their feet as artillery fire pounded the ground, sending shockwaves that rattled the teeth and made it hard to stand upright. The stench of smoke, sweat, and blood hung heavy over the landscape, a noxious cloud that clung to every surface like a malignant entity. To the north, the enemy's tanks had broken through the lines, their treads screeching as they churned up the earth, spewing forth a maelstrom of fire and steel that cut down anyone who dared to stand in their way. The defenders, a mix of seasoned veterans and green recruits, scrambled to respond, launching a hail of anti-tank missiles and cannon fire that struck the armored behemoths with deafening crashes. Yet, the tanks kept coming, their armor scarred and blackened, but still they pushed forward, driven by the relentless will of their crews. On the eastern flank, the infantry clashed in a frenzy of bayonets and bullets, the two sides locked in a struggle that seemed to have no end. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the cries of the wounded, the ground slicked with the blood of the fallen. Every step forward was bought with the life of a comrade, every meter of ground gained at the cost of a friend's limb or life. And still, the soldiers pushed on, driven by a ferocity that bordered on madness, their hearts fueled by a cocktail of fear, adrenaline, and duty. To the west, the artillery duel reached its crescendo, the big guns booming out a rhythm of death that shook the very foundations of the earth. The shells whistled through the air, their trajectories marked by wispy trails of smoke that seemed to hang suspended in the air, as if mocking the very notion of gravity. The defenders, guns, a mix of vintage howitzers and modern self-propelled cannons, spat out a deadly rain of high-explosive shells that struck the enemy's positions with unerring accuracy, sending geysers of dirt and debris high into the air. In the midst of this maelstrom, a small band of soldiers found themselves cut off from the rest of their unit, surrounded by the enemy on all sides. They huddled together, their faces set in grim determination as they prepared to make a last stand against overwhelming odds. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant with a face like worn leather, glanced around at his comrades, his eyes locking onto each of theirs in a silent understanding. They knew what was coming, and they steeled themselves for the impact, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they might not survive the next few minutes. The enemy closed in, their movements cautious, as if they sensed the desperation that drove the surrounded soldiers. The sergeant's team waited, their guns at the ready, their fingers tightening around the triggers as the enemy drew nearer. And then, in a burst of fury, the sergeant's team unleashed a withering blast of gunfire, their bullets ripping into the enemy ranks with deadly precision. The enemy returned fire, their shots whistling past the sergeant's team, striking the ground with loud thuds that sent shrapnel flying in all directions. The sergeant's team held their ground, firing and firing, their guns roaring out a deadly rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But the enemy was too strong, their numbers too great. And slowly, inexorably, they began to push the sergeant's team back. The soldiers fought with every ounce of strength they possessed, their bodies screaming in protest as they absorbed the punishment, their minds numbed with the knowledge that they were running out of time. In a desperate bid to turn the tide, the sergeant grabbed a nearby grenade, its cool metal a comforting weight in his hand. He pulled the pin, the spoon flying off with a soft clink, and then, with a swift motion, he lobbed the grenade into the enemy's midst. The explosion was instantaneous, a blinding flash of light that seemed to freeze time itself. The enemy's advance faltered, their ranks broken, as the sergeant's team seized the opportunity to launch a fierce counterattack. The battle raged on, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance, as the soldiers on both sides clashed in a frenzy of bullets and bayonets. The sergeant's team fought with every ounce of strength they possessed, their hearts fueled by a desperate desire to survive, to emerge victorious from the carnage that surrounded them. And yet, despite their bravery, despite their sacrifice, the enemy seemed endless, their numbers inexhaustible, as if they were a Hydra-like monster that could not be killed. The sergeant's team began to falter, their energy waning, their bodies battered and bruised. The enemy sensed their weakness, and with a triumphant cry, they launched a final, decisive assault. The sergeant's team stood firm, their guns blazing, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were about to make the ultimate sacrifice. And then, in a burst of fury, the enemy overwhelmed them, their numbers too great, their firepower too strong. The sergeant's team disappeared in a maelstrom of blood and steel, their bodies broken, their spirits shattered. The battle raged on, the outcome still uncertain, as the soldiers on both sides clashed in a frenzy of violence. The earth was scorched, the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood, the very fabric of reality seeming to unravel in the face of such unmitigated chaos. And yet, amidst the carnage, a glimmer of hope emerged. A chance for the defenders to turn the tide, to emerge victorious from the abyss of blood and steel that surrounded them. The question was, would they be able to seize it, or would they succumb to the overwhelming odds that stacked against them? Only time would tell. The aftermath of the catastrophic event was a scene of utter devastation, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder. The once pristine landscape was now a desolate expanse of rubble and ash, with the stench of smoke and death hanging heavy in the air. The survivors, shell-shocked and dazed, stumbled through the wreckage, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope or rescue. As the initial shock began to wear off, the true extent of the disaster became clear. The casualty reports were staggering, with entire units wiped out in an instant. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, a haunting reminder of the horrors that had been unleashed. Medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the injured, but their efforts were often in vain, as the sheer scale of the devastation overwhelmed their capabilities. Among the survivors was a young soldier, barely out of his teens, who had been caught in the midst of the chaos. He had been separated from his unit in the initial blast, and had spent the past hour stumbling through the wreckage, searching for any sign of his comrades. His eyes were sunken, his face smeared with dirt and grit, and his uniform was torn and tattered. He walked with a limp, his leg throbbing in pain from a shrapnel wound he had sustained during the blast. As he walked, he stumbled upon a group of survivors huddled together in a makeshift shelter. They were a mix of soldiers and civilians, all of whom had been caught up in the disaster. They welcomed him with open arms, offering what little food and water they had managed to scrounge up. The young soldier collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and traumatized, as the others began to tend to his wound. One of the civilians, a woman in her mid-30s, took charge of the group, organizing them into a cohesive unit. She had been a nurse before the disaster, and her medical skills proved invaluable as she worked to treat the wounded. Her name was Sarah, and she quickly became the de facto leader of the group, guiding them through the darkest of times. As the day wore on, the group began to hear rumors of other survivors, scattered throughout the devastated landscape. They knew they had to keep moving, to find safety and shelter in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Sarah took charge, leading the group through the ruins, ever vigilant for any sign of danger. The journey was arduous, with the group facing numerous challenges along the way. They had to navigate treacherous terrain, avoiding collapsed buildings and rubble-strewn streets. They encountered other survivors, some of whom were hostile, and had to defend themselves against marauders and scavengers. Despite the dangers, the group persevered, driven by their determination to survive. They banded together, relying on each other for support and comfort. They shared what little food and water they had, and worked together to overcome the obstacles they faced. As night began to fall, the group found themselves at the edge of a small town, one that had been largely spared the worst of the devastation. They stumbled upon a makeshift hospital, set up by a team of medical volunteers who had rushed to the scene to provide aid. The group was met with open arms, as the medical team worked to treat their wounds and provide them with food and shelter. The young soldier, whose name was Jack, was finally able to receive the medical attention he so desperately needed. His wound was cleaned and bandaged, and he was given a hot meal and a warm blanket. As he lay on the hospital bed, surrounded by the sounds of suffering and the smell of disinfectant, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but for the first time since the disaster, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the night wore on, Jack's thoughts turned to his family and the life he had left behind. He wondered if they were still alive, and if he would ever see them again. He thought of his fellow soldiers, the ones he had fought alongside, and the ones who had not been so lucky. He felt a sense of guilt and survivor's guilt, knowing that he had made it through the disaster when so many others had not. The hospital was a scene of chaos and confusion, with medical staff working tirelessly to treat the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of blood and disinfectant, and the sounds of suffering filled the air. Despite the chaos, the medical team worked with precision and dedication, doing everything in their power to save as many lives as possible. As the night wore on, the hospital became a beacon of hope in a desperate time. It was a place of refuge, a place where the survivors could find shelter and comfort. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still goodness in the world, and that there were still people who cared. The days that followed were a blur of activity, as the survivors worked to rebuild and recover. They formed a community, bound together by their shared experiences and their determination to survive. They worked together to provide food and shelter, and to rebuild their shattered lives. As the weeks turned into months, the community began to flourish. They built new homes, using materials scavenged from the rubble. They established a system of government, with leaders elected by the community. They formed a militia, to protect themselves from the dangers that still lurked in the outside world. The young soldier, Jack, became a leader in the community, using his military training to help protect and defend the group. He worked closely with Sarah, the nurse who had become the de facto leader of the group. Together, they helped to build a new society, one that was forged in the fire of adversity. As the months turned into years, the community continued to grow and thrive. They faced many challenges along the way, from raids by marauders to diseases that swept through the population. But they persevered, relying on each other for support and comfort. The disaster that had struck their world had been a catastrophic event, one that had changed the course of history. But it had also brought the survivors together, forging a new community that was strong and resilient. They had been through the fire and had emerged stronger, their bonds forged in the heat of adversity. The years that followed were a time of rebuilding and recovery, as the survivors worked to create a new world from the ashes of the old. They faced many challenges along the way, but they persevered, driven by their determination to survive and thrive. And as they looked out upon the new world they had created, they knew that they had truly earned their place in it, forged in the fire of adversity, and tempered by the hardships they had faced. As we conclude our examination of the complex and multifaceted nature of military history, it is essential to delve into the long-term geopolitical impact of the events and conflicts that have shaped our world. The repercussions of war and strategic alliances have far-reaching consequences, often influencing the course of global events for decades, if not centuries, to come. The intricate web of relationships between nations, forged in the fire of conflict, can lead to a delicate balance of power, as each side navigates the ever-shifting landscape of international relations. The aftermath of major conflicts, such as World War I and World War II, has significantly altered the global landscape, leading to the emergence of new world powers and the redrawing of national borders. The Treaty of Versailles, for instance, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, contributing to widespread resentment and creating a fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take hold. Similarly, the Yalta Conference and the subsequent division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs set the stage for the Cold War, a period of ideological tension and proxy conflicts that would dominate international relations for nearly 5 decades. The legacy of colonialism and imperialism also continues to shape the modern world, as many nations struggle to come to terms with their complex and often fraught histories. The arbitrary borders imposed by colonial powers have led to numerous conflicts, as ethnic and nationalist tensions simmer just below the surface. The Middle East, in particular, has been a flashpoint for conflict, as the legacy of colonialism and the subsequent redrawing of national borders have created a volatile mix of competing interests and rival claims. In addition to these broader geopolitical trends, it is also important to consider the human costs of conflict and the long-term impact on individuals and communities. The trauma and displacement caused by war can have a lasting impact on generations, as families and communities struggle to rebuild and come to terms with their experiences. The importance of providing support and assistance to those affected by conflict cannot be overstated, as it is essential to promoting healing, reconciliation, and lasting peace. As we reflect on the complex and often fraught nature of military history, it is clear that the study of conflict and strategy is essential to understanding the modern world. By examining the successes and failures of past leaders and nations, we can gain valuable insights into the complexities of international relations and the challenges of promoting peace and stability in a rapidly changing world. Ultimately, the study of military history serves as a reminder of the importance of diplomacy, cooperation, and dialogue in preventing conflict and promoting a more just and peaceful world. As we conclude this series, we are left with a profound sense of the complexity and nuance of human conflict and the enduring impact that it has on our world. The legacy of war and strategic alliances continues to shape our global landscape, influencing the course of events in ways both seen and unseen. And so, as we move forward into an increasingly uncertain future, it is essential that we remain mindful of the lessons of the past and strive to create a world in which conflict is a rare and unfortunate exception, rather than a common and accepted fact of life. In the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, "War is the father of all and the king of all, and some he has made gods and some men, some bond and some free." As we consider the profound impact of conflict on our world, we are reminded of the enduring power of this statement, and the importance of working towards a future in which the devastating effects of war are a distant memory, rather than a lived reality. As you have joined me on this journey through the complexities of military history, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the fascinating and often misunderstood world of warfare and strategy. Together, we can work towards a deeper understanding of the past and a more nuanced appreciation of the complexities of the present. By subscribing, you will gain access to a wide range of content, including in-depth analyses of historical conflicts, strategic think pieces, and insightful interviews with leading experts in the field. Join us as we delve into the intricacies of military history and explore the ways in which the legacy of conflict continues to shape our world today.